scripture passage today is Exodus 19, and I'll actually be reading verses 1 through 9, as well as Exodus 21 through 17. So I'll be jumping straight from chapter 19 to chapter 20, and you're welcome to follow along with your Bible. Listen for the word of the Lord. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone forth out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. And when they set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, they were encamped in the wilderness. And there Israel encamped before the mountain. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people in Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all peoples. For all of the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, "Lo, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever." And God spoke all these words, saying, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, or your son, or your daughter, or your manservant, or your maidservant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which the Lord your God gives you. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's." This is the word of the Lord. Now last week, we heard about how God took the Israelites out of the house of slavery, out of the house of bondage. If you remember, they were being pursued by the Egyptians and their chariots, and the Israelites were standing at the edge of the waters of the Red Sea. God's presence was in front of them in the form of a pillar of a cloud that had led them to the Red Sea, and behind them were the Egyptians chasing them. And the pillar moved from the front of them to behind them and blocked the view of the injustice that they were fleeing, allowing them to focus on where God was leading them to, allowing them to focus on the path God had prepared for them. God freed the people from slavery because Pharaoh would not. After hearing God's voice, Moses went to Pharaoh to ask that the Israelites would be allowed to leave Egypt and worship God in the wilderness. After fleeing Egypt, the Israelites finally made it to the wilderness. In this week's text, it has been almost 3 months since that event. Since they left, the Israelites have had 2 water crises, a food crisis, an attack from another nation, and they've developed some beginning parts of an organization. They've been in the wilderness for almost 3 months, and at times they've begun to wonder if they really are any better off than they were in Egypt. Now they are free, but what are they going to do in the wilderness? Why have they been freed? What were they freed for? Why have they been led into the wilderness? In the struggles they have faced, the people have learned to trust God, that God will care for them. God helped solve their water crisis, gave them water, gave them food, and they've learned that their needs matter to God. But they haven't really learned yet why God has been doing all of this. And I think we can relate to that struggle. And I also think that the story of the people of Israel can help us to understand the struggle of living between gratitude towards God and an uncertain future. We may have a lot to thank God for. We can thank God for friends and family. We can thank God for freedom and security. We can thank God for being able to live through each day. But there's always another crisis. We still feel alone, we struggle to make ends meet, and we still live with fear. And if we don't, we know someone who does. And sometimes we might ask, why has God brought us this far? Even in our collective stories in modern history, we also face this question. Slavery has been abolished, but human trafficking continues. Civil rights were passed into law, but a white policeman can still shoot an innocent black boy and leave his body for 4 hours sitting on the sidewalk without being held accountable. Global nuclear war can be averted, but we seem trapped in a cycle of perpetual international violence, moving from war to war. Why has God brought humanity this far? Have we been brought to the wilderness to wander till we die? Surely God is at work in humanity and in our lives for justice. But why has God brought us to the wilderness? After traveling for almost 3 months, the people of Israel arrive at Mount Sinai. God tells the people of Israel through Moses, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself." God brought the people of Israel out of Egypt to bring them to God's self. When they have been traveling in the wilderness, they have been traveling toward God. God continues, "Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." God provides for God's people, but God also asks things of God's people. God asks those who hear God's voice to live in covenant. Before we move on to what that means, I want to call attention to all of the relational language that God is using. Sometimes we view the covenant like some sort of legal document that takes precedence over relationship. But it is a bit more like putting a relationship into writing so that generations of people will be able to remember it. The word that is translated as obey in obey my voice primarily means to hear. But the understanding is that if you have really heard, you're going to obey what God has said. At this point in history, the Jewish law has not been compiled, so keeping the covenant really is an agreement to trust and follow God as God continues to reveal God's plan, since they hadn't had a law to agree to following. So this isn't a legalistic contract. This is an agreement of trust. If the people of Israel hear God's voice and respect the relationship of trust which God has established, then Israel will be a priestly kingdom, the example of what it looks like to live a life of worship to God. Being a priestly nation identifies Israel as a people which ministers to the rest of the world. This will be what sets Israel apart and defines them as a people, a nation. God established a covenant with Abraham that Abraham would be blessed and that the whole world would be blessed through Abraham. As Abraham was set apart, Israel is set apart as a community. As Abraham learned to trust and follow God, his descendants are now asked to trust and follow God. Another thing we need to notice is that disobeying God's voice and abandoning the covenant does not abolish the relationship that's established. The relationship is damaged, but not forgotten. Throughout the Bible, God remembers the covenant even when Israel has abandoned it, because of God's steadfast love and mercy, which, as we saw in the Ten Commandments, is repaid to the third and the fourth generation. Sometimes the language of covenant can sound like a cold and legalistic contract, but it is the naming of a relationship. God frees Israel so that Israel may worship God and live as a priestly nation. Even if it does not always go as planned, that is the relationship that God promises to be faithful to and that God's people are called to keep. As the people of Israel face crisis after crisis, God will keep calling them back to worship. As the Westminster Shorter Catechism says, the chief end of humanity is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. This is beautiful, but it can ring hollow sometimes when we are faced with a crisis of our own, or when we look at the injustice that continues in the world. Surely God has brought us to the wilderness for worship, but what does worship have to do with the problems that we face? To answer that, we have to look at what it means to worship God, to hear God's voice, and to keep God's covenant, to participate in the relationship which God has initiated. The Ten Commandments are part of what it looks like to be faithful to that relationship. The first few commandments are focused on keeping a proper relationship with God, but many of them are focused on keeping just relationships between humans. Since they are all God's commandments, the Ten Commandments also show us how following God leads to serving justice in the world. This is a connection that Jesus also emphasized. When Jesus was asked which commandment was the greatest, he responded, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now Jesus was only asked to give one commandment, the greatest commandment. But he could not separate the two, because in order to do one is to do the other. To turn toward God is to also turn towards justice, humanity. To hear God's voice and to keep God's covenant. To hear God's voice and keep God's covenant is to have no other gods greater than God, to not create or worship any human-created idols, to respect the name of God and to keep the Sabbath holy. But following God also means We must honor our parents, be faithful to our spouses and partners, not to steal, to tell the truth when we are asked, and not lusting after what other people have. We cannot be in right relationship with God if we are not in right relationship with each other. It is part of what it means to leave Egypt and go to the wilderness and worship God. God led the people of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness so that they could live a life of worship and community with each other, a life which was not possible in the house of slavery under Pharaoh's rule. Freedom from injustice, the people of Israel, freed from injustice, the people of Israel practiced justice as an act of worship to the God who brought them out of Egypt, which is part of their priestly service to the world. Also, as the commandment to keep the Sabbath holy implies, this is part of participating in creation. God created the world in the 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. The people of Israel are asked to share that rest with the world. Not only are they to rest, but their whole households are to rest, including their animals. Did you know your relationship with God affects your relationship with your dog? God told the people of Israel, "Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." What does it mean to serve as a minister to the planet itself? The Ten Commandments show God's rest is to be shared with creation itself, and they remind us that humanity plays an important part in caring for creation, a role we would do well to remember. The Ten Commandments are just a small piece of the law which God works out with Moses and the people of Israel. But it helps us to understand on a basic level what it means to worship God, what it has to do with serving justice in the world, and what it has to do with caring for creation. We may not be the people of Israel, but I believe we are all here because we have heard God's voice in some way. We have some experience of God's liberation. And just as in this text, what we have seen and what we have heard implores us to live a life of worship which serves God and justice in the world. The relationship God named with Israel on Sinai helps us better understand the relationship God calls us to. We can see a pattern of God's character and God's call that rings true for us today. God calls us away from injustice so that we may be free for worship. In worship, we are called not only to be faithful to our relationship to God, but we are also called to be faithful in our relationships with each other and with creation. While we may not be a priestly nation, God has called us each of us, to ministry in the world. It is why we work for justice and peace in our communities in the world. It's why we are taking a peacemaking offering. It is part of our worship as a community. It is why we have been brought to the wilderness, to worship God, and as part of that worship, to share God's justice with the world. God works for our liberation, not because of how good we are at serving God, but because of who God is. We respond in worship, serving God and working for justice in the world, not because of who we have been, but because of who God has called us to be together. Friends, this is good news. Thanks be to God.